I was lucky enough to marry Ree Smith, working together on our family ranch west of Pawhuska. I don't think she ever wants to see another feed bill for the rest of her life.
I'm going to take them ranch-style chicken sandwiches, one of my husband's favorite sandwiches. They're grilled chicken breast top.
There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a household when life changes without warning. It is not the silence of peace or contentment. It is the silence of adjustment, of recalibration, of two people learning a new language for a life they never anticipated living. On the vast, windswept plains of Osage County in northeast Oklahoma, that silence has found its way into the Drummond household, and the man who once defined himself entirely by the dust on his boots and the cattle under his care has been quietly, profoundly rewriting the story of who he is. Ladd Drummond is not a man given to grand announcements. He is not the type to sit down in front of a camera and deliver an emotional monologue about personal transformation. He expresses himself in actions, in the decisions he makes before sunrise, in the way he positions himself beside his wife at medical appointments he once would never have attended, in the small daily choices that have collectively added up to something that everyone around him has noticed, even if they haven't been able to name it. What they are witnessing is a man in the process of saying goodbye. Not to his marriage, not to his land, and not to the life he built, but to a version of himself that no longer serves the people he loves most. The story of how Ladd Drummond arrived at this crossroads begins, as so many American stories do, with land and legacy, with a woman who changed everything, and with a diagnosis that forced both of them to look clearly at what they had been taking for granted. Ladd Drummond grew up understanding that the land beneath his feet was not simply property, it was identity. The Drummond family has worked their Oklahoma ranch across multiple generations, operating one of the largest cattle ranching operations in the entire United States, spanning hundreds of thousands of acres across Osage County. From boyhood, Ladd absorbed the rhythms and rituals of ranch life, the pre-dawn starts, the physical demands, the seasons dictating everything from breeding schedules to market timing. By the time he reached adulthood, ranching wasn't something he did, it was something he was. Into this world came Marie Smith, known to virtually everyone as Ree, a city-raised woman who had been heading toward a different kind of life entirely before a chance encounter with a quiet, cowboy hat-wearing rancher rerouted her plans. She had been accepted to law school when she met Ladd. The pull between her previous trajectory and this unexpected person from the wide-open Oklahoma plains created an internal tension that she would later write about with humor and honesty, describing herself as a woman who had to consciously choose a life she hadn't imagined. She chose it. They married in 1996, and Ree moved to the ranch. What followed was something neither of them could have predicted. In 2006, Ree began writing a blog, initially just personal dispatches about the daily reality of ranch life, cooking meals for a hungry family, raising children in a remote part of the country, and navigating the particular comedy of a woman from a suburban background learning to live in cattle country. The writing was warm, funny, self-deprecating, and immediately relatable to a vast audience of women who saw something of themselves in her stories, even if their lives looked nothing like hers. The blog became a phenomenon. It led to a Food Network show, a string of best-selling cookbooks, a retail and restaurant destination called the Mercantile in downtown Pawhuska, Oklahoma, and a brand worth tens of millions of dollars. Ree Drummond became the pioneer woman, a carefully cultivated but genuinely authentic persona built on the premise that her life, for all its beauty and absurdity, was worth sharing. And at the center of that life, often photographed from a distance, rarely saying much, was Ladd, the strong, silent cowboy whose very reticence became part of the brand's charm. Before anyone fully understood what was happening in the Drummond household in recent years, it is necessary to go back to March 2021, because that single event planted the seeds of everything that followed. Ladd and his nephew Caleb were fighting a grass fire on the ranch, a relatively routine hazard on Oklahoma rangeland during dry months, when their two fire trucks collided in the chaos of the emergency. The accident was immediately serious. Caleb was transported by helicopter to a hospital in critical condition. Ladd, in the characteristically stubborn fashion of a man who has spent a lifetime treating injuries as inconveniences, initially refused an ambulance and drove himself to the hospital. It was at the hospital that doctors discovered the full gravity of what had happened to him. Ladd had broken his neck in 2 places. The injuries were the kind that, with slightly different physics, could have left him paralyzed or worse. Surgeons operated. He wore a neck brace through recovery. He was told, in terms that cannot be misunderstood, that he was fortunate to be walking and talking and breathing without assistance. For a man who had worked through broken bones, concussions, and the ordinary brutality of decades of physical ranch labor without ever truly slowing down, being forced to be still, to accept help, to let others handle work that he had always considered his personal responsibility, was a genuinely foreign experience. What received less attention at the time was the effect of that accident on Ree. She had come within a very short distance of losing her husband on their own property on an ordinary afternoon in March. The man who was the anchor of her life and the co-architect of everything they had built together had nearly died, and she had not been there when it happened. That kind of near loss rewires a person's relationship with time and priority in ways that aren't always immediately visible. Ree processed it publicly with the lightness and humor that her audience had come to expect. The Drummond way was to find the story in the crisis, to share it with some warmth and perspective. But people who knew her well could see that something had shifted behind the familiar presentation. She began monitoring her phone more carefully. She thought more frequently about what would happen if the next phone call brought different news. The accident introduced a dimension of vulnerability into a life that had seemed, from the outside, almost charmed in its abundance and stability. Neither Ladd nor Ree addressed this emotional reality publicly at the time, but informed everything that came after. Ree Drummond built her brand on a foundational commitment to transparency. Her audience did not simply watch cooking demonstrations, they were invited into her life. They knew what her kitchen looked like at 6 in the morning. They knew which of her children was struggling in school, and which one had an unexpected talent. They knew what Ladd said over breakfast that made her laugh. This openness was not an accident or a calculated content strategy, at least not initially. It was simply who she was, a woman who processed her world through language and found genuine joy in connecting with people she had never met. That is why, when the content began to shift in the second half of 2023, people noticed. The candid, rambling posts about ranch mishaps became less frequent. The spontaneous kitchen videos that used to document spectacular cooking failures disappeared. The long, personal essays that had distinguished her blog from every other food site on the internet grew sporadic, and then nearly stopped. What remained was polished and appealing but noticeably less personal, more like the product of a media brand than the diary of a real person. The comment sections on her social media accounts began filling with concerned messages from followers who had been reading her work for 15 years and could sense that something was different without being able to articulate exactly what. Her Food Network show continued filming, but people close to the production observed changes. Filming days that had once stretched across 12 or more hours were shortened. Ree, who had been known for her physical stamina on set and her willingness to do as many takes as needed to get something right, began requesting more frequent breaks. The warm energy she brought to every episode remained, but there were moments, captured on camera and visible to those looking carefully, that suggested a woman managing something beneath the surface of her cheerfulness. Guest appearances on other programs declined. Promotional commitments were scaled back. Book signings that previously drew enormous crowds were limited to a smaller number of cities. Cookbook publication timelines stretched longer between releases. Her team consistently cited scheduling conflicts and prior commitments as explanations, and most of the media accepted those explanations at face value. But the cumulative pattern told a clearer story to anyone willing to read it. Ree Drummond was conserving energy, protecting herself, creating space where none had previously existed, and she wasn't explaining why. The full picture came together in early 2024 during what Ree had described to herself as a long overdue and comprehensive medical evaluation. She had been experiencing symptoms that, taken individually, were easy to rationalize away. Persistent fatigue that she attributed to overwork. Headaches that she assumed were the product of stress. A sense of physical depletion that she had been dismissing as the natural consequence of running multiple businesses simultaneously while managing family life on a working ranch. She was a busy woman doing too many things at once. Of course, she was tired. But when she finally submitted to a thorough examination, the results reframed everything she had been experiencing. The diagnosis was not a temporary condition with a straightforward treatment and a clear recovery timeline. It was a chronic health issue requiring long-term management, significant lifestyle restructuring, and a fundamental rethinking of how she moved through her days. The specifics of the diagnosis have not been disclosed publicly in clinical detail. The Drummonds have maintained their characteristically private approach to matters they consider personal. But what has become evident through the changes in their behavior and statements is that this is a condition with which Ree will live for the rest of her life, one that has ongoing effects on her energy, her capacity, and her planning. Doctors were direct with her about the role of stress in managing her condition. For a woman whose professional identity had been built on doing everything simultaneously and making it look effortless, the prescription to reduce stress represented a particular kind of challenge. The television show, the blog, the cookbooks, the mercantile, the social media presence, the personal appearances, the licensing partnerships, each of these was independently manageable. Together, they constituted a pressure system that her body was no longer equipped to sustain. The diagnosis made clear that if she continued at the pace she had been maintaining, the consequences would be serious. The medications required careful management. Side effects needed to be tracked and reported. Dietary adjustments were necessary. Regular medical appointments with specialists in multiple cities became a fixed feature of her calendar rather than an occasional inconvenience. For a woman who had spent years being the person who organized everyone else's schedule, suddenly needing her own life organized around medical necessity was disorienting. The adjustment was not only physical, it was a renegotiation of identity. Ladd Drummond received this news as a man who has spent his entire life solving problems with physical action and practical decision-making. He is not someone who processes difficulty through extended conversation or public expression of emotion. When something is broken on the ranch, you fix it. When storm threatens the cattle, you move the cattle. When a challenge presents itself, you respond with whatever the situation requires. The diagnosis of his wife's chronic condition presented him with a problem that could not be solved in the traditional sense. It required something more demanding than any emergency the ranch had ever produced. It required sustained, long-term presence and a willingness to fundamentally reorganize his priorities. His response was not dramatic or publicly announced. It was simply behavioral. Ranch hands who had worked alongside Ladd for decades began noticing that he was leaving the fields earlier in the afternoons. The man who had been the first person on horseback at sunrise and the last one in at dusk was now regularly home by late afternoon. His brothers, Tim and Todd, were receiving phone calls about decisions that Ladd had previously made entirely alone. Cattle sales, land management questions, equipment purchases, the large-scale financial and operational decisions that governed a ranching enterprise spread across hundreds of thousands of acres. These began moving through a collaborative process rather than resting exclusively on Ladd's judgment.